In our last two lectures, we examined the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution itself, and the Bill of Rights. That Constitution is the most successful form of government in history. The British philosopher and educator Alfred North Whitehead said that only twice in history had an extraordinarily difficult set of political problems been handled as well as possible, close to perfection. One was the Emperor Augustus and the settlement he brought to the Roman Empire, and the second was the Constitutional Convention and the founders of the United States and its Constitution. Liberty under law was their goal, and in achieving that goal, they were remarkably successful. We enjoy the best government in the world today, but that government was bought at a price. The price of the American Civil War. And it is to the Civil War as another defining event in the history not only of freedom in the United States, but in the history of freedom in the world that we wish to turn now. We focus our two lectures around two individuals, Robert E. Lee as the embodiment of the cause of the Confederacy, and Abraham Lincoln as the second founder of the United States. For that is what the Civil War turned out to be, a second foundation of this nation, as Lincoln himself would say, a new birth of freedom. Now, the Civil War was brought on by the fact that, despite all their wisdom, the founders were not able to resolve two fundamental issues at the Constitutional Convention: slavery and states' rights. The failure to resolve these issues was the result of the need to find a compromise that would allow the Constitution to be adopted. States' rights was such a difficult issue that although certain aspects of these were clearly defined, nonetheless, the fundamental question, as we mentioned at the end of our last lecture, of where the ultimate loyalty of a citizen lay, to the nation or to the state, was not resolved. But even more difficult of resolution was the issue of slavery. It was clear that the southern states would not sign the Constitution if it forbade slavery. This, even though leaders of the delegation from Virginia, like George Mason, himself a large slave owner, argued against slavery in the Constitution. But as adopted, the Constitution of the United States made slavery an intrinsic part of itself. Slaves were used to account for the proportionate representation, reckoned at 3/5 of a person. They thus became intrinsic to the election of representatives. The slave trade was recognized and taxed by the federal government. A clause said that until 1808, no measures would be made limiting the importation of such persons as states wished to import, and that a tax could be levied not to exceed $10. So not only was slavery not forbidden, the federal government would benefit from it in financial terms. And then finally, the federal government forbade states to allow slaves to escape there and remain free. No, by the Constitution they were obliged to return them, even a free state, to return them to their former status of slavery in the slave state. So, in the eyes of those who understood what a moral wrong slavery was, this had to be seen as a pact with hell. Thomas Jefferson knew that one day his country would be called to a reckoning. Now, it was true that some of the finest minds of the ages and the entire tradition of natural law held liberty to be compatible with slavery. Aristotle had said so. Cicero had said so. The jurist of the Roman Empire in the Code of Justinian had justified slavery as the statement of the laws of mankind, jus gentium, opposed to the jus naturale, the law of God, by which all men were free and equal, but by the law of mankind, human beings could be held in slavery. But Jefferson, George Mason, though they owned slaves, knew better. And the course of world opinion over the next 80 years after the adoption of the Constitution knew better. And the British Empire had abolished slavery in the year 1833. But in the United States, slavery continued to be viewed as a purely domestic institution. Now, this wasn't true in every regard, as Abraham Lincoln would point out. The same Congress which brought forth the Bill of Rights also passed the Northwest Ordinance, originally put forth by the Articles of Confederation, the Congress acting under the Articles of Confederation. And it said that the federal government had the right to forbid slavery in new territories. And in the Northwest Territories, slavery was to be forever forbidden. So the federal government could, in fact, forbid slavery in that instance. And so the issues hardened. And ultimately, the Civil War would come. That war that Jefferson had foreseen as a fire bell ringing in the night. It is a civil war, I think, without parallels in history. It was fought with great savagery, and yet at the end there was a reconciliation. To such a degree that heroes of a cause that fought against its own country, men like Robert E. Lee, became heroes of the entire country. And after having been responsible for the death of 623,026 Americans, men like Lee, all the soldiers who had served the Southern Confederacy so gallantly, were not treated as traitors, not imprisoned, but allowed to go back to their own lives. It is a grand story, and it is a story essential to our understanding of liberty. Because the American Civil War was at its heart a war over conflicting ideas of liberty, democratic versus Republican liberty. The Union represented the cause of democratic liberty, a broad, inclusive concept of liberty invoked by the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created free and equal. It is an expansionistic ideal of liberty, capable of making the United States truly the ark of the liberties to the world, where people can come to the United States from everywhere and have the equality of opportunity to achieve their dreams. The Confederacy represented the Republican ideal of liberty, and it is an ideal rooted in the Constitution. The Confederates believed that they were following the model of the founders of their country. Their seal would show George Washington upon it and bear the proud Latin motto, "God will vindicate us." It was a narrow and exclusive concept of liberty, one believing that men are equal only before the law, and that, not if they are slaves. Like the classical concept of freedom, it believed that liberty was compatible with slavery. It was fostered in small, homogeneous republics and really incapable of expanding to diverse nations and cultures. Yet this was the liberty of the Constitution. Slavery was a domestic institution for each state to deal with as its citizens chose. And if slavery were to be abolished, it was for the individual states to do so. And to allow the federal government to do it was to create a precedent for despotic, tyrannical central government. For states' rights was viewed by the Confederacy and by Robert E. Lee as the ultimate check on the power of the federal government. And so it was that when Abraham Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, states like South Carolina believed that they were merely echoing the tradition of the Revolution. A government had been elected which would abandon its trust to govern for the benefit of the whole, would strike down the Constitution, so they said, so the Confederates said, by interfering with the domestic institution of slavery. And like George Washington, they seceded. They renounced their allegiance to a tyrannical government, citing their inalienable right to resist tyranny. The embodiment of that cause would come to be Robert E. Lee. He was born January the 17th in 1807, the son of a distinguished Virginian, a gallant general in the American Revolution, Light Horse Harry Lee. He had played a major role in the Revolution in the South, and he had been cited as one of the most significant figures in the victory over the British. He was a close friend of George Washington, and Washington was a frequent visitor to his home. When Washington died, it would be Light Horse Harry Lee who was chosen to give the eulogy and would proclaim that Washington had been first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. A great career lay open for Light Horse Harry Lee, and government service in Congress as governor of Virginia. It was a time when fortunes could be made by speculating in western lands. And Light Horse Harry Lee was one who speculated and one who lost his money. He lost first his money and then his reputation as he borrowed and was unable to pay back loans. And the earliest memory of Robert E. Lee was of the men of the sheriff coming to his home and taking away assets. Robert E. Lee came from a distinguished family when his relatives had a great deal of money. But he grew up in rather straitened circumstances. Grew up in a small house in Alexandria, and when time came for him to go to college, there wasn't enough money. And his mother turned to the idea of the military academy at West Point, where he would receive free tuition, room and board, even a small stipend. And the letters written to secure his admission to the military academy spoke glowingly of the service his father had rendered to the infant republic. And so Lee went to West Point, graduated second in the class of 1829, and began a career in the United States Army as an engineer. In the meantime, he married, and his wife came from this great tradition of freedom. She was the daughter of George Washington's adopted son, George Washington Parke Custis. Lee would carry in his vest the pocket watch that Washington had carried. He would use the spyglass of Washington. And in making his ultimate decision to serve the Confederacy, he would believe that he was following in the path of George Washington. Lee was a gallant soldier in the Mexican War, and when the Americans were celebrating their banquet in the halls of Montezuma, General Winfield Scott toasted Robert E. Lee as the officer to whom the most was owed. But promotion came very slow in the Army of those days. There wasn't a retirement plan, and generals just stayed in service until they died. And so Lee, despite all his bravery and gallantry, despite the mentoring of General Winfield Scott, was still just a colonel, serving in Texas as the crisis over secession deepened. He was at home in Arlington when the secession crisis reached its peak, taking care of elements of his father-in-law's estate, when he received a summons to come across the Potomac River to meet with his mentor, General Winfield Scott. Now, it is important to note that Robert E. Lee, who served the Southern Confederacy so gallantly, never owned a square inch of land in Virginia. And he himself never owned a slave. And he very carefully carried out the manumission, the liberation of those slaves his wife inherited from his father-in-law. He believed slavery to be a great moral wrong. But he also believed that it was for the people of Virginia to decide when it should be abolished. He would later write to Lord Acton, the historian of liberty and an admirer of Lee's, that he believed, Lee did, in the Constitution. But he believed that states' rights were essential to the balance of the Constitution and the safeguard of the continuance of free government. The consolidation of the states, Lee said, into one vast republic was sure to be aggressive abroad and despotic at home, and would be the ruin of freedom. The South, Lee believed, fought for the supremacy of the Constitution and its laws. He and other citizens of Virginia had long wanted slavery abolished, but wanted it done by the states. And so he met with General Winfield Scott on this day in April 1861. And Scott said that he, under the authority of President Abraham Lincoln, wanted to offer to Robert E. Lee command of the field armies of the United States with immediate promotion to general. Now, for you or me, what a career move that would be. All those years in service and now jumped over all the other officers to do nothing except your duty. Lee was an officer in the United States Army. He had sworn an oath. But he said immediately, no. Winfield Scott stood up, extended his hand and said, Lee, you are making the biggest mistake of your life. But I knew it would be so. Lee, like Washington before him, followed his conscience. Remember, when Washington took command of the Continental armies, he was a traitor. He was a traitor to his king. And so Lee became a traitor to the United States of America in pursuit of a higher cause, his conscience. This conscience, this morality, this integrity of Lee was something everyone recognized. General Grant spoke about it, that once Lee had made up his mind that something was right or wrong, there was no changing it. And so Lee resigned from the United States Army, took a position as military advisor to Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy. And then, on June the 1st, 1862, he took command of the Army of Northern Virginia. And from the time he assumed that command, he led the Army of Northern Virginia to victories that would resound throughout history. Names like Second Manassas, the drawn Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, which Lee viewed as his masterpiece against a far larger army holding his interior lines and withdrawing in good order. The stunning victory at Fredericksburg. And then, May the 2nd through May the 5th, 1863, the Battle of Chancellorsville. A battle that is still studied as a masterpiece of a flanking action by which an army more than twice as large is utterly driven from the field. That battle would raise Lee's reputation both in this country and in Europe to its apex. He was compared with Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Napoleon as one of the 4 greatest captains in history. Viscount Wolsey, British observer who knew Lee well, would write towards the end of his career, "It has been my privilege to know many of the leading figures and personalities of our age. I have admired them and their qualities, but only once in my life have I been aware that I was in the presence of true greatness, and that was with Robert E. Lee." Observers who saw the Confederate Army there in the field at Chancellorsville, their faces all blackened from the smoke, resounding as Lee rode through them, Lee, 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 and then witnessed a line of Union soldiers take off their hat to him, and one of them step forward and say, "I wish you were ours." And note how Lee, who always saluted his officers, but took off his hat to the enlisted men who he admired so much, solemnly took off his hat and nodded to the Union soldiers. One observer wrote, "Having witnessed that scene, I understood why it was that the ancients elevated their great generals to the level of divinity." But the loss in that battle had been the death of Stonewall Jackson. And days later, when Jackson's body was laid to rest in the Shenandoah Valley, Lee was not present, nor was Jefferson Davis, nor any member of the cabinet. They were meeting in the Confederate White House to discuss Lee's bold plan of an invasion of Pennsylvania and his belief that one more great victory over the Union Army would force negotiations that would lead to the recognition of the Southern Confederacy. And so, in June, Lee led his army across the Potomac. Hardly less remarkable than the general they followed was the army itself. Sons of the most distinguished families of Virginia, men from hardscrabble farms in northern Alabama and the backwoods of Georgia, university boys like the University Grays of Mississippi, and hard-bitten men from Arkansas and Texas who picked their teeth with bowie knives. The Texans were Lee's favorite troops. On one occasion they were marching by and a British observer said, "But General Lee, those men have no seats to their pants, and I'm afraid they're not wearing underwear." And Lee said, "Don't worry. The enemy never sees the backs of my Texans." So that army marched with him. It was an army that you could literally, so they said, the observers, smell before you saw it coming. They were a most dirty and ragged, ravenous pack of wolves, a northern farmer wrote. They seemed to carry themselves nonetheless with a panache that was lacking in our far better fed and equipped Union soldiers. Their cavalry rode their horses like circus riders. The only thing clean about them were their teeth from their constant diet of apples and corn on the cob, and their guns. Many of them came from the deep South and spoke a dialect we could barely understand, and they were profane beyond all belief. That was the army that Lee led into Pennsylvania and to the unwanted battle on the field at Gettysburg. For 3 days, the two great armies clashed from the 1st to the 3rd of 1863. And on the 3rd day, believing that the Union Army was just about to crack, Lee sent forth 15,000 picked men in Pickett's charge. It was not a wild, hopeless decision. The best military tactics of the day told Lee that it would succeed. The Battle of Solferino, the last major battle before the American Civil War in Italy, between the French and Italian troops on the one hand and the Austrians, had been won by the French and Italians precisely by a heavy artillery bombardment and then an assault, a direct frontal assault upon a fortified, entrenched position of the enemy on higher ground. The French and Italians had broken the Austrian line, and Lee believed his men would too. But they did not. They were driven back. And as they stumbled back over that field, Lee rode out to them. Now again, ponder today. If such a disaster happened in a modern army, the general in charge would be looking for the lowest person on the chain to blame. And his spin masters would be eagerly at work. Not so Lee. He wrote out, "It's all my fault, boys, all my fault. I have gotten us into a terrible place, and you must help me get us out." And so, in a rain, the next day, the Army of Virginia made its way back across the Potomac, leaving behind the flower of its manhood. That same day, July the 4th, the great port city of Vicksburg fell. The city of Vicksburg would not celebrate July the 4th again until 1945. These two defeats marked the beginning of the end and the long road down to Appomattox. Nonetheless, such was his skill, despite ever-dwindling resources, that Lee continued the resistance. Until on Palm Sunday, April the 9th, 1865, early that morning, his aide was surprised to see Lee come out in full dress uniform. Lee was a modest man. On both sides, generals normally occupied palatial homes, dined in splendor. Never Lee. He lived in a simple tent, a cracker barrel as his desk, cracker barrel stamped property of a New Jersey regiment. Not even that was his own. When he was given picnic baskets full of ham and biscuits, he distributed them among his men. But he came out this morning in full dress, sash, sword, and his aide said, "Why are you so dressed up?" "I fear," Lee said, "I must go see General Grant today. I would die 1,000 deaths in preference." For indeed, the city of Petersburg had fallen. Lee's army was straggling along the road to Lynchburg, trying to get to that city and take trains down to join up with the remnants of the Confederate Army in North Carolina. But late the day before, heavy Union enforcements had been found across the road. Lee had sent out a cavalry contingent that April the 9th morning, only to have it report back that it was not only cavalry, but heavy infantry across the road. The Army of Northern Virginia could not get through. And so Lee would go to the little town of Appomattox Courthouse, to meet with General Grant. Grant arrived and immediately shook hands with Lee and said, "I remember meeting you during the Mexican War. Do you remember meeting me?" And Lee said, "Yes, I do. I remember it well." Later on, he would confess, "I have tried and tried to recall that meeting without success." Grant talked so much about the Mexican War that Lee had to bring him back to the question at hand. And Lee asked, "What terms?" And Grant responded, "The terms that I have already mentioned to you. The most generous of terms. The Confederate soldiers under Lee's command would be paroled, sent back to their homes, with just the promise not to take up arms against the United States again." Lee brought up the question of federal prisoners and said he had a number of Union prisoners who were living on the same rations as his men, a few handfuls of parched corn a day. Grant said, "Turn them over immediately," and then, without asking Lee to beg for it, said, "Do your men need provisions?" And Lee said, "Yes." And Grant immediately gave the order that food be given to these starving Confederate troops. Later on, Lee would never allow anything bad to be said about General Grant. And so the surrender was made. Lee returned to his home in Virginia, bankrupt. But he accepted the job at Washington College. He had long thought about education, long thought about the kind of education that Southern youth needed, and there proved in his 5 years, from 1865 to 1870, to be the innovator in education that he had been in military tactics, raising money for a chair, creating a school of business. And there he was in October 1870, attending a meeting of the board of the Episcopal Church, where the board was unwilling to give the pastor a small raise in salary. Lee said he would pay it out of his own pocket. Went back home. In that same church, Lee had stood up and then knelt beside a black man who had come to take communion. The congregation, which at first refused to come down when they saw Lee kneel, all came down and knelt beside him. For as the governor of Virginia said, if General Lee says something is right, then it is right. Such was his moral authority. A stroke hit him that October day after the meeting of the board of the church. He would linger on for a few days. His mind, as his daughter wrote, drifting back to the scenes of those dreadful battles. He died on October the 12th, 1870, thinking himself a far greater failure than his father had ever been. After all, Light Horse Harry Lee had only destroyed his fortunes. Lee believed that he had ruined his country. But we're not always the best judges of how well we've succeeded in life. Theodore Roosevelt would say that Lee was one of the two greatest Americans, ranking him alongside his idol, George Washington. So it was that Robert E. Lee avoided the easy road to worldly fame and fortune offered to him by Winfield Scott, and chose instead to follow what he saw as the course of honor. And hewing straight to that course, he followed his honor to greatness.